Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, September 5th, 2022, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. And before we dive in, I just want to apologize and thank all of you for your patience. Last week's episode, as you may have noticed, did not air. That's okay. We're not skipping anything. We're just bumping everything back. That's because I moved across the country from Los Angeles, California to Fort Lauderdale, Florida for a one-year internship for my PhD in clinical psychology. And I was hoping to be able to juggle everything at once, but I was not. I'm here now. I'm actually recording from my new apartment in Florida, where I'll be living for the next year. It's beautiful outside. It's very hot, but it's really beautiful. And I'm loving all of the stunning wildlife. I'm loving the kindness of all of the people. And it's just, it's a huge change. I'm settling in. I'm definitely recording this amongst some piles of things in my apartment that haven't yet been sorted, but I'm settling in. And I'm just so grateful for everybody for coming along with me for this wild ride. So before we talk about the episode, I do want to, as always, thank those of you who support the show. Remember, Talk Nerdyism will always be 100% free to download. That's because I rely on listener support from individuals just like you. If you're interested in pledging, you can do it on an episodic basis, as little as like $1 an episode. I think if you pledge $2 an episode, you get an ad-free version of the show. This week's top patrons include Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Dudas Infinitas, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo Gonzalez, Joe Wilkinson, Leonard Prince, Pasquale Gelati, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all so much. You make this show possible. All right, so let's talk a little bit about this week's episode. So I had the opportunity to sit down with, remotely of course, with two sociologists, and they co-authored a new book called Dreams of a Lifetime: How Who We Are Shapes How We Imagine Our Future. Dr. Karen Cerulo is a professor of sociology at Rutgers University. She's also the editor of Sociological Forum and has written several books, including Never Saw It Coming, Cultural Challenges to Envisioning the Worst, and Deciphering Violence, The Cognitive Structure of Right and Wrong. Dr. Janet Ruane is professor emerita of sociology at Montclair State University, and she has written Introducing Social Research Methods and also co-authored with Dr. Cerulo, Second Thoughts, Sociology Challenges Conventional Wisdom. So this book is all about kind of who we are and how we dream. And I don't mean dreaming at night, but I mean dreaming about the future and how where we come from, what opportunities we had, all of those different factors really do come into play when digging deep into how we dream. They did a really interesting study where they spoke to many, many people to get their perspectives, and they're going to share a lot of those outcomes with us now. So without any further ado, here they are, Doctors Cerulo and Ruane. Well, Karen and Janet, thank you guys so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having us.
Yep. I'm very excited to talk about your new book, Dreams of a Lifetime: How Who We Are Shapes How We Imagine Our Future. And of course, you are both sociologists. So I was hoping maybe we could start at the very top, just with some introductions. Maybe you could tell me a little bit about what each of you focused on, kind of what your educational path was and how you sort of found your niche within your careers.
Well, I started out as a psychology major, actually, as an undergraduate. And the program I was in turned out to be one that was heavily experimental versus clinical. And I wasn't the direction I wanted to go. And at the same time, I was taking a lot of sociology classes and kind of fell in love with it. So I ended up getting a degree in sociology at Rutgers, and I went on to get my PhD at Princeton. And I've taught for a few years at Stony Brook out in Long Island, and then have been back at Rutgers at my own alma mater teaching as a professor in the sociology department for a little bit over 30 years now.
Oh, very cool. And Janet, before we get to you, I'm wondering, Karen, what for those who are listening who are maybe a little bit like, I've never really understood what the difference is between sociology and psychology. Maybe you could clarify that a bit.
Yeah, I think psychologists can talk to you and tell you what might happen to you or what might you do if you make certain alterations or what might have affected you in your personal biography. Whereas a sociologist is looking at the big picture. We're looking at groups, we're looking at communities, and we're saying, I can't predict what will happen to any one person, but I can tell you the likelihood or the probability of what will happen as a general trend or a pattern.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And so Janet, tell us a little bit about your path and your journey.
Well, I can honestly say my interest in and really thinking it as some of our founding members of the field have said, the queen science happened back in high school. And I took a sociology class in high school. Probably one of the few high schools at that time that was offering such a class. And I just thought there's no better explanation for life than knowing the social forces that are impacting us. And so I just went on to a college major and then a PhD program. I'm a PhD from Rutgers and have done 40 plus years of teaching here in at Rutgers and at Montclair State University in New Jersey.
Wow, wow. Oh, that's fascinating. And so I'm curious from both of you, as you sort of developed or you, I guess, went through your academic path, you started teaching, you started doing your research. Sociology is such a big topic. It's such a broad field. Where do you guys find crossover, or where did you find crossover in your specific focus within sociology?
Well, I think for us, it's been popular culture because I primarily study culture and cognition and areas of inequality. Jan does some different areas, which she'll talk about, but we both shared this interest in popular culture and the messages it exudes and the potential impact it can have on people. And I think when we would sit down and talk about books and television shows and movies that we saw and how people were reacting to them and the impact we thought they might be having on people, that was something that would always keep our conversation going. And I think there's a lot of popular culture that runs through many of the things that we've written together, the Dreams book and several other things.
My earliest interest was in social control, and I thought, there's so many factors that go into controlling our behaviors, influencing our behaviors, and yes, eventually came to see that another way of looking at that was the impact of culture, popular culture on people's lives. No escaping it. Absolutely. So what enormous an influence.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so, this book specifically, Dreams of a Lifetime, you're really focusing not just on exactly what you were talking about, this concept of culture and kind of our social place and how we are affected, but really what it means to. And when I say dream, because I've done shows before about dreams, and I'm like in those shows, we were talking about actual, like physical kind of like REM sleep dreaming. But here we're talking about aspirations, goals, right? We're talking about the dreams for you as an individual and the dreams for your life.
Well, I think we try to differentiate what we're talking about a little bit from aspirations or even hopes, in that those are things that are sort of planted in reality. Career goals. You get sick, something happens to you in real life, and you hope to get better. But we're talking about, dreams you have while you're wide awake. We can think of them as fantasies or future imaginings about things that if nothing was in your way, if there were no obstacles, where would you like to be? What would you like to be? Where would you like to go? What would you love your future to look like? Those are the kinds of things that this book taps.
Yeah, we really are thinking about those moments you take for yourself where you envision your future. And so we're closer to daydreaming, I'd say. Wouldn't you care than we are to
Yes.
night dreaming, or even things that require and do receive focused planning? Dreams don't. They're really, we are interested in them and think they're worthy of a study unto themselves because we think it's where people's core exists. Thoreau said it was the touchstone of our character. And so we were interested in seeing when people close their eyes, what is it they envision for their future days?
Right. And of course, I think there's this very easy, and this is really the one of the central theses of your book, but it's very easy to sort of slip into this idea of the quote American dream, or that there is some sort of Pollyanna view that everybody dreams the same for themselves. Everybody has these fantasies that are grounded in so-called, whatever this means, American culture. And you guys really kind of blow the lid off that. You show that individuals are constrained. They're really, maybe constrained isn't the right word, but they're really shaped by their background. They're shaped by how they grew up, who they grew up with, and how society has long treated them. Our dreams are not, I don't know, universal, are they?
Not at all. Not at all. We acknowledge that the American dream is probably used very frequently to explain Americans' career paths or the interest in immigrants coming to this nation. Well, of course, it's to achieve the American dream, but no, we have found that that there is much more, and that, frankly, the American dream, or dreaming, I should say, has not been well studied.
We weren't sure what we were going to find when we started, because we thought, on the one hand, there's this feeling that every individual is unique, and so everybody's going to have a completely different dream. And then there's, the other end of the continuum, where we're in the U.S. and everybody's going to talk about something that is a form of the American dream. We wondered what we were going to get, and what we heard was something that was in between. And yes, as you nicely stated it, something that was molded by what we call your social location, meaning what's your gender, what's your race, what's your social class, are you employed, are you not, what sort of life events have you dealt with, where are you in the life course, in terms of age. All of those things brought patterns to people's dreaming. And so there was no one single dream, nor were there 272 different dreams. That was the number of people we talked to. There were certain themes and certain patterns that we found, and those patterns were very much tied to where people stood in the society.
I'm going to get kind of wonky for just a second. I'm curious, as I personally dive deep into my PhD dissertation now. I'm doing a dissertation in psychology, but I'm doing a qualitative phenomenological dissertation. I'm curious what your sort of study design was, and I know that you were doing this for the book, but like you said, you had 272 different individuals that you interviewed. How did you go about, what was your sort of approach to the interviews and to sort of analyzing the interviews, to get a little academic for a second?
I'm a big believer in merging both quantitative and qualitative work. I always feel, what I tell my students, pretend you're a photographer and you have a wide angle lens in your box and you have a telephoto lens in your box. And, how are you going to decide which one to use? Well, it depends on the shot you want. And I think research is very much like that. Some things you want to do quantitative work to get a big picture and look at trends. And other times you really want to dig deep and you need to do qualitative work. And so we decided to do a little bit of both. Our initial talks with people were in either focus groups of 5 or 6 people or one-on-one interviews. And that gave us the opportunity to really dig deeply and get a lot of qualitative data that we could reflect on and report on. But we also collected information on people's backgrounds, that allowed us to do quantitative analysis of what kind of things impact others. And so the book, I think, is a combination of that, although we try very hard to translate everything so that I think anybody reading this book could understand the findings without having any sort of methodological training.
I'd like to add that we also standardized the interview guide so that we asked every respondent questions about the content or themes of their dreams, the flexibility of their dreams, the feasibility, the reach, were they short or long term, their clarity, could they describe it in detail or not, the social scope, were they alone in their dreams or did they need an ensemble? The longevity, and even what we call the portability. Were their dreams something they hoped to pass on to others? So we tried to standardize so that we would get the same type of information from, and just to speak to the sampling strategy a bit, we intentionally tried to get interviews and focus groups with a very, very diverse group of people. So we started with third graders. We went up to folks who were in their 70s and 80s. We went to community groups. We interviewed people who were unemployed as well as people who were employed, healthy individuals and those facing health challenges. We intentionally did that so that all of the things you would imagine could possibly influence people's dreaming, we would have an ability to take a look at.
And so clearly you had this kind of standardized interview form. I'm curious, what was the sort of main question? Was it just, what do you dream? Like, how did you get to the heart of the question?
Well, we started every group and interview by saying to someone, if you knew you couldn't fail, what would you do? Or where would you go? Or what would you want to have? Or what would you want to be? And people actually wrote down 3 answers to that question so that we had a record of what first came to their minds. We asked people to prioritize those answers. What's most important to you on that list? And then we would talk about their answers, either in a group or one-on-one. And that gave us the opportunity to really get a good picture of what people were dreaming about, what they wanted their futures to look like, whether or not they thought it could really happen or not, but what they wanted to see in their futures. And then we were able to take off on some of these other dimensions, like, who's with you in your dream? How long have you had the dream, et cetera.
We also, methodologically, we wanted to make sure that once people started talking, they weren't then changing their dreams or being influenced by other folks in the focus group setting. So that was part of our reliability check to make sure that folks were reporting on what they had written, and we were able to double check that.
So I'm curious about your findings. I can imagine that they really, really were all over the place. And obviously we could approach this in a lot of different ways, but maybe we start with what were some of the convergent findings. What did you find were relatively universal? Was there anything that most people described, any themes that were pretty consistent? And then maybe we'll get into where they all diverged.
Well, I think we found 6 major themes that we could classify everyone's dreams in. Some people dreamed about adventure, having adventures. Some people had career dreams. Some dreamed about, having fame, wealth, and power. Some dreamed about self-improvement. Some about family, something to do with developing a family or, salvaging a family. Within those categories, we were able to then delve a little deeper and see if there was differences within the broad categories. But those were the general areas that people spoke. Oh, philanthropy. That was one last.
That's right.
One last category that we saw coming up quite frequently.
Okay, so you sort of saw thematic similarities, but not necessarily similarities in, valence or specifics within those themes.
Well, we can say that to our surprise, I think, we were amazed at how clear people were. How many people could give vivid details of their dreams? We were also intrigued by the fact that not everyone, but a great number of people were interested and thought they would try to pass their dreams on to others if they didn't manage to achieve them. They would try and thought it important to try to pass their dreams on.
I think, too, that take the category of philanthropy, for example. There was some variety in that category, but there was a lot of overlap. We had a number of people, for example, who wanted to, in some ways, engage in animal rescues. We had other people who, for example, either themselves had a medical issue or knew someone who did and wanted to open a center where they could either help people deal with that or themselves get a degree so that they could help cure this disease. So there was a fair amount of overlap even within these categories.
I can imagine, and I'm probably sort of jumping ahead here, though, that depending on where somebody is in their developmental stage of their life, really like their age, must have had a really significant influence on how they dreamed, right? Because, like you were saying, some people were saying, this is something I'd love to do, and I want to go to school to prepare for it. But of course, older adults, some of them might be saying that, or some of their dreams might be adjusted based on their own lifespan.
Well, I think a couple of things surprised us with regard to age. Start by talking about we interviewed third and fourth graders. And the third graders were, kind of a hoot. I mean, they had dreams like they wanted to fly. They wanted to wish they could become invisible. They wanted to be able to hold their breath underwater indefinitely. It was those kinds of things. By the time we got to fourth grade, the dreams were much more realistic. So we had some capitalists in the fourth grade who wanted to earn $1 million and then double it somehow and then buy the Eiffel Tower. Or one girl who said she wanted to have a mansion and a pool, and because she loved pickles, wanted to have her as many pickles as possible. So that was one of the things that surprised us, that we really seemed to catch a transitional age in life right around fourth grade where people sort of started to catch on to the expectations of what it means to dream. I think the other thing, and Jan, if you want to talk about this, was what surprised us were the senior citizens.
Well, before we move on, I just wanted to point out that we saw part of this coming down to a realistic set of dreams when we heard about the fourth graders in the Uvalde shooting. Those kids were planning already some serious careers or dreaming, I should correct myself, of having a future in the law or a future in marine biology, I believe. So we heard, as part of the tragedy there, that those dreams had already been formed and were never to be. And sorry to interrupt you, Cara, but
No,
No, that's
absolutely.
okay.
Yeah. I mean, it is fascinating that you guys did seem to kind of stumble upon this I don't want to say universal, because I'm sure it did vary, but a kind of theme that you saw, which is that from third to fourth grade there were some big changes in the way that children relate their own inner worlds to their outer worlds, and they started to put those kinds of constraints on themselves to say,
yeah.
oh, this is an actual goal I might be able to achieve versus, I don't really, I'm still struggling a little bit with reality testing.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
Just to keep the age order, high school, college students were very, very focused on careers and fame, wealth, and power. There was no other group more concerned with achieving fame, wealth, and power. That really dissipated as we moved on through the age groups. The other interesting thing we found was it took you to, you needed to get into your 30s or 40s before you started reporting family dreams in double digits. So that was the big breakthrough there. Young adults were not talking necessarily about family dreams. But yes, when you got into your 30s, yeah, family became important. And family never really dropped out. But as they aged, fewer dreams were about family. And our respondents would say they were done with parenting. They were over. And so they were perhaps liberated. And we saw that. We saw that aging tended to have a liberating effect on dreaming.
A couple of other things regarding age is that people who were in that early midlife group, so, they had been married for a few years, they had some children, they were actually the most, I want to say, restricted dreamers. And that surprised me a little bit, because what I thought going in, we would hear from people in that moment of life, is that they were having dreams for their children. But what so many of people in that age group told us was that they really didn't have the luxury of dreaming, that right now their job was to make sure their kids got settled, and that dreaming was too much of a luxury for them at this point in time. One last thing about the senior citizens, they were incredibly effervescent dreamers, and sort of thought, they had nothing left to lose, so why not consider doing some things? We talked to one woman who wanted to motorcycle across the country with her daughter, and, was able to describe they were going to have matching jackets, and they could feel the wind in their hair. We had another guy in his 70s who had never had a bit of political experience, but was absolutely sure that he could still become president, and that was his dream. And when we talked a little bit about it, he said, Donald Trump never had any political experience, but he did it, so why couldn't I? We had a guy who was dreaming about being able to levitate his body. The senior citizens had some really vivid and exciting dreams, whitewater rafting, one woman who wanted to go back to school and become a doctor, even though she was in her 70s. So there was this kind of devil-may-care attitude among the 70s, people in their 70s and 80s. And they kind of felt like, if not now, when? So they were thinking in very broad terms.
I love that.
Let me also add that when you asked earlier about was there a similarity or convergence of findings, we heard it most enthusiastically from the seniors in our study, that dreaming was essential, that there was you'd be stripping life of meaning if you didn't dream. But honestly, that theme, that dreaming was an essential life endeavor, was articulated by a majority of our respondents.
I have to say, and this is just, kind of from a personal perspective, the area that I'm settling more and more into as I continue my journey in clinical psychology is psycho-oncology, life-limiting illness, end of life. And of course, a lot of that involves working with older adults. And I just find this group to be the most existential, the most reflective, the most, in some ways, like you said, liberated and free and inspiring, because there's this beautiful combination of wisdom and insight and a real understanding of mortality that I think is fundamental to how we dream. Because if we fancy ourselves immortal, which is how many young people think, the constraints are different. And the older that we get and the more that we kind of have that insight of how precious life really is, it does affect our dreams, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And they were some of the most uplifting groups that we did. We really enjoyed them. And they really went on for a long time because people were very enthusiastic and wanted to share.
They did not want the focus groups or interviews to end. They just, what, we're done already? They were the ones who wanted to keep on talking.
Yeah.
And to pick up on your point, the other thing that really blew us away when you mentioned mortality, it was our health challenged respondents. Oh, they were dreamers, almost in a class by themselves in terms of their positivity about dreaming. They're being convinced, they were the most convinced of any of our groups that they would be able to achieve their dreams.
There's
Talk
this
about heartfelt and uplifting. Those were great sessions.
Absolutely. There's this funny thing that happens when I personally tell people what it is I do, who I talk to for a living and what I study. And it's so silly to me how many people think, oh gosh, that must be very depressing. People who are very, very sick or who are struggling with these life-limiting illnesses must be very, I don't know, must be very, unwilling to find joy in life or to live for the future. And it's like, no, it's really the opposite. And it's just so clear how few people actually take the time to talk to people that aren't in their generation and be with them and listen to them and learn from them.
Well, and getting back to the point about essential dreaming, it was this group, the Health Challenge, that's 100% of them really felt dreaming to be important. They wouldn't live without it.
So that actually leads me then to another question, because I'm thinking about sort of what is intuitive, what is counterintuitive. And I think for many people, when they think about older adults, there are a lot of counterintuitive findings that, of course, become intuitive the longer that you spend time with older adults. But there's another group that I'm very, very curious about, and that's the group of individuals who have deeply suffered losses, or what we might call in existential psychology, boundary experiences, people who have been exposed to war or genocide or famine or deep interpersonal violence. And I'm curious how they are affected. Is their dreaming stifled, or is it promoted? What happens to individuals when they suffer these traumatic experiences, or what happens to their dreams?
I think it varied. One of the hardest groups for us to deal with were people who had been recently unemployed or had been unemployed for a long period of time. These people, unemployed. Yeah, they were very, very down.
I'd like to say they were blocked. I think that really
that's a good way to put it.
Yeah. And so that was a particular life event that really seemed to impede dreaming. And in many cases, these folks had been lost their jobs on multiple times. So you can imagine in a society where, your career and the work ethic is so powerful, how devastating being unemployed can be for someone. And we really saw that devastation in the groups and interviews we did with folks in that position. On the other hand, we did some interviews with people who had been displaced because of hurricanes and natural disasters, or people who had been homeless or even were homeless when we were speaking to them. And they were, on the other hand, very hopeful. I remember one woman who had just saved enough to build a home for herself, to buy her own home, and then the home was completely destroyed by a hurricane. And you would think that that would demolish you, but no, she was intent that she was going to do everything she could to be in a position to buy another home, and she was very confident that it would happen. She wasn't going to let that stop her from getting her dream. And you would think that these kinds of disasters, or being homeless, would be totally debilitating, as we found unemployment. But that wasn't the case with that group. So very much seemed to depend on, what was the disaster you were facing.
Right. The respondents, the homeless, the victims of natural disasters, they still clung to optimism and positive cultural lessons about dreaming. And there was a bit of realism in there, in that they thought that dreams absolutely needed hard work in order to come true, but they were committed to doing that hard work.
I'm definitely curious, and this kind of gets to be a little bit more, or it dips its toe into our sort of political ideological landscape right now. But I'm definitely curious about the dreams of individuals for whom historic, institutional, and systemic favors have not been present, right? For groups of women, for groups of people of color, for groups of gender minorities, or just minorities across the board, for whom work doesn't necessarily equal success, and for whom the playing field has never really been level. Did you see a significant difference in how they dreamed? Was there more realism in their dreams, for example, than the sort of privileged class that you interviewed?
Yes, I think on a number of dimensions we saw that. We asked people to self-identify their class. And people who self-identified as lower class were the people who were least likely to sort of dream big. They had more pessimism than optimism in terms of whether or not they would achieve their dreams. And while they still thought it was important to dream and sometimes found some comfort in just the activity of dreaming, they were least likely to feel that their dreams would ever come true. When it came to race,
well, before we go off social class, I think again to put a finer point on something just said, lower class individuals didn't dream of adventure. It was a totally missing category. And on the other hand, our upper class respondents didn't dream of fame, wealth, and power.
Oh, interesting.
And you can put an interpretation there that I think is pretty obvious, as adventure being a luxury for the lower class, and fame, wealth, and power perhaps being seen as redundant for the other class.
Right. Oh, that's fascinating. It's actually surprising to me, because I would almost expect that the upper class would dream even more of wealth, fame, and power. Sort of like, it doesn't matter how much wealth, fame, and power we have, we just want more. But I do definitely, I can't put my finger on it, so we don't have to dwell on it too much, but I do definitely see these parallels with sort of a historical colonial view, patriarchal kind of view of like manifest destiny and sort of imperialism, and this even National Geographic, I think, somewhat recently had a big piece about sort of their history, and that this is not just a good thing to celebrate, going out across the globe and exploring, because in doing so, it's often very extractive, and it's very much at the expense of indigenous people and local people within those regions. And so it's fascinating to me that individuals who themselves never had that sort of privilege, and of course were more readily exploited, don't want to be the colonialists, don't want to be the explorers.
To maybe put again a better a take on their ignoring fame, wealth, and power. When they talked about dreaming, their dominant dream for the upper class was career oriented, and it was always about improving their job title, improving their intake of wealth. It was about improving their lot in life, but with a career, a path.
Right. That makes sense. Absolutely. And Karen, you were about to dive into race.
Yeah, I was going to say that we found that our Latinx respondents differed from all the other racial groups that we dealt with in a couple of important ways. They were more likely than any other group to embrace the sort of negative lessons there are out there. Like, the deck is stacked, or if you rise too fast, you're going to fall and fail. Whereas the other racial groups very much clung to the many, many positive lessons about dreaming, important to dream big. If you work hard enough, you'll get what you want. Be optimistic, all of that. Second, our Latinx respondents were least confident about achieving their dreams. Out of all of the racial groups we talked about, they were the one group that said, yeah, I have this dream, but the majority of them felt there was no chance it could ever happen to them. And that was very different from our other racial groups, all of whom, the majority of which thought, yeah, this is possible. It's certainly possible, and I'm going to continue thinking about it and hoping it can happen. I think the other thing that struck us was that sometimes, in terms of the themes of people's dreams, careers, or adventure, we could see two groups having the same dream in a particular theme. So let's say career. But if you compared racial groups, let's say you compared Asians with the Latinx respondents, you found that career meant something very, very different. For our Asian respondents, it meant, really having being the head of a large corporation. That's what a career meant. Or being a world famous doctor or a corporate lawyer. Whereas career for the Latinx respondents meant something like just having a job that was consistent, or owning a small shop like a flower shop or a delicatessen. So while they were both engaged in career dreaming, the meaning of career was very different to them.
I like to say again that it was dreaming with a big C, career with a big C for the Asians, for instance, and for the Latinx population, a career with a small c.
I can only imagine that the obvious takeaway here is that our dreams are not genetic. They are not universal, that the human kind of condition. And so I've long really identified with this view, this very kind of atheistic existential view that existence precedes essence, that there is no fundamental human nature, that we just are, we're thrown into our social standing. And then society really, really deeply influences how we think, how we relate to one another. And it sounds to me like, you grow up within a certain culture, within a certain neighborhood, with certain parents and grandparents and ideas just this, even the small, almost immeasurable ways that people look at you, talk to you, think about you, that you internalize on a daily basis. This shapes how much you think you can be, who you think you can be, what you think you can achieve.
And that is one of the sad findings here of this book, in that, in some ways, people from certain groups are discouraged even before the game has begun, so to speak.
Yeah. I've got to ask then, did you see, or maybe the questions didn't go into this area, but I can only imagine that women and men dream differently, because we are living against a background that has long promoted the dreams of men and long taught women that their dreams, their aspirations are somewhat secondary. It's not, even in 2022, it's not uncommon for men to be raised in a very career-oriented, very kind of self-actualization way, and women to be raised to land themselves a man.
Yeah, let me start us off by saying that as we might expect because of culture, career was a dominant theme for both men and women. Mm-hmm. And philanthropy was an important dream there. But after that, we absolutely saw gender socialization kicking in people's dreams.
And so what does that look like, gender socialization? Like, what are the outcomes that you saw that were clearly shaped by the way we're raised?
We saw women, for example, then identifying things like family as most important, which, having children, holding together a family, which I think as being, a very gender-specific kind of thing that is placed on the shoulders of women, and self-improvement. And most of the self-improvement dreams were about losing weight, appearance, changing their appearance. Again, very gender stereotypical. The men, in contrast, were dreaming about adventures and fame, wealth, and power. Again, that's sort of male oriented, what we teach in our society. And so we saw those gender breakdowns coming to the foreground as we talked with men and women.
The other thing that I think was interesting is that women as dreamers were more willing to switch out their dreams if needed. I think that was telling.
Yes. Yeah.
Men, they were also, more optimistic. They embraced more than men positive cultural scripts, and a majority of them would never give up on their dreams, as opposed to a significantly lower percentage of men thinking they would never give up. So and men were more likely to embrace a negative cultural script. So, there's a reality smashing in there, I think, on folks, as well as cultural scripts of socialization.
Oh, interesting. I'm also like just deeply curious. And obviously, this is not something that you explicitly studied because your entire group, even if they were first gen or second gen, your entire group was a group of American respondents, right? Like this was a project that you did here in the United States. So obviously, you weren't comparing an American group to a group of Europeans, for example, or a group of African respondents. But I am curious about your takeaway as to how much this sort of American ideal, whether we want to call it manifest destiny or capitalism or individualism or all of these kind of cultural scripts that are so deeply Western seem to dominate people's dreams or seem to be maybe a template or a foundation on which they dreamed. I can only imagine that our dreams here in America are significantly different than the dreams of individuals in wildly different cultures.
Yeah, we're hoping to find that out to see if we can duplicate the study in other countries. But I think that from other work we've done, there's no question that Americans and the idea of optimism are so deeply entrenched in our society that the idea that you can get anything you dream of is something that may be much more pronounced among Americans than those in other countries. Perhaps there's some of that in Western European countries, but I think when we get into Asian countries, African countries, we would see something very different.
The other thing that we attribute to the American culture was the incredible degree to which dreaming is a solo activity. When we'd ask people, well, who else is in that dream with you? Most often they would say, no, it's me, just me. And, it just a little, maybe explains why some folks are never going to achieve their dreams. We conclude, that you need so much more than the dream itself, that you need some sort of support, some structural and social support. But that we thought was absolutely screamingly American, that dreaming would be so solo an endeavor.
Yeah, it's so individualistic. And it reminds me of those old studies where individuals would be given some sort of skills test or knowledge test and then asked to rate how they think they fell on a continuum. Were you in the 70th percentile, the 40th percentile? And like by and large, Americans, we just all think we're better than average, and that like doesn't hold true in other cultures. Like in other cultures, they either sometimes underestimate, sometimes overestimate, or pretty well place themselves on the continuum because they think about the entire continuum. But we're just like, no. Well, but I'm the best, right? Like just me,
right.
Myself, all by myself. I'm the best. Such an individualist view. It's just fascinating to me how, I mean, you cannot ignore when you read these outcomes,
how much we are shaped by how we are raised, how much we are shaped by the opportunities that we see in front of us, and just this dominant script that is everywhere. It's everywhere. Like we often talk about, I've done lots of episodes on the show about unconscious bias and about, racism or sexism, and how even we, I'm a woman and I still internalize sexism all the time. It's like you just can't not be shaped by your culture. It's everything.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Oh, it's just so fascinating. I feel like I could be asking a million more questions of you. Of course, I don't want to keep you all day. And of course, I want people to check out the book so that they can get some of these answers for themselves. And because I have two of you here on the show, I'm hoping, I'm going to ask you one question first, and then I'm hoping you can both answer my final two questions. I always close my show by asking my guests the same two questions because I think it's, I don't know, this is like a little bit scientific of me to be able to kind of compare week to week how people are thinking about the world. But before we dive into that, I'm just curious from both of you, Karen and Janet, is there anything that we didn't really touch on, any themes, any takeaways that you feel like are kind of important to make sure that we point out before we wrap up?
Well, one takeaway I think that's important is what we should do to help people dream in an effective way. So, we found that some people are just dreaming because it's escapism for them, or it thrills them, or it soothes them. And, if that is the purpose, that's fine. But if you're dreaming and really hoping to make a dream come true, then, we think it's really important that dreams become aspirations, that somebody be helping the dreamer with pathways to accomplishing that dream. And that might be something that happens in a school system. It might be something that happens with having a mentor. But just as we would help someone entering college who we thought didn't have enough math classes, and we give them remedial math classes, we think that some groups need remedial dreaming classes so that they can see what the paths would be to accomplishing a dream, what the obstacles would be, and how you might overcome them, rather than becoming discouraged and sort of withdrawing from planning a future.
Oh, absolutely. This idea of hope, but hope being rooted in reality. I think it's so important. One of the kind of foci that are near and dear to my heart is women in STEM. And we often talk about this idea that if you can't see it, you can't see yourself as it. And so we have to have cultural examples of these dreams for individuals who aren't just the cis white hetero script, because for almost all of human history, especially in Western society, that's all that, the vast majority of dreams were filled by. And so, it's very easy for young white boys to say, yeah, I could be that. It's much harder for girls and girls of color to say, yeah, that's actually an option for me.
Right. Well, I like to sort of distill some of our findings into the simple fact that dreaming is not an equal opportunity endeavor.
Right.
And I think we absolutely kid ourselves when we think that the sky's the limit when dreaming. No, it isn't. I mean, we really do have to, and we don't have to, but we are under the forces of society where we constrain our dreaming.
Yeah,
depending
it's almost
on
like
our social locations. Yeah.
Yeah, it's almost like the sky could only be the limit if the ground was even underneath our feet, and it's not. It's just not. Hopefully we get to a point where it is. And I think work like the work that you guys are doing is so important to help us get there. But as of right now, we also have to be realists. At the same time that we're dreamers and optimists, we need to be realists as well. So I am very curious from both of you. And I guess the way we'll do it is maybe we answer the first question first and the second question second. So I ask all of my guests the same two questions, and they're sort of big picture questions about the future. So I want the two of you, in whatever context feels relevant to you. So obviously this could be contextualized sort of by the work that you do, but it could also be personal. It could be communal. It could be global. It could be cosmic. Doesn't really matter. First, what is the thing that really does keep you up the most at night? The thing you're most concerned about? Maybe you do find yourself dancing with pessimism or even cynicism. And then on the flip side of that, from a really genuine and authentic place, where are you finding your hope, your optimism? Not Pollyanna, but like true hope. What are you looking forward to? So maybe we could do it one of two ways. You could either answer both questions each, or you could both do the kind of negative Nelly question, and then we could end on a more positive note.
Let's do that. We'll do the negative Nelly question each. Yeah. I think the thing that keeps me up at night is can we maintain our democracy? And while I'm certainly very concerned about democracy in the United States, I think it goes well beyond the United States. We're seeing democracy threatened globally. And the kinds of things that have happened in the United States over the past 3-4 years are such a threat to where we go in the future that, it does keep me up at night.
Yeah. Along similar lines, I am so disturbed by the tendency right now of facts not mattering, of truth being something that just doesn't seem to matter anymore, that evidence can be ignored. And my real fear is that it will lead to disaster that's of an epic proportion. I don't think I've lived through anything, and I'm old enough to have lived through quite a few things as disturbing as Russia invading Ukraine. And I thought we learned this history lesson already, and it seems as if a great number, too many people have not learned this lesson. So where do you find your hope, Carrie?
Right. I'm so curious. It's very common that individuals will find hope on the other side of the coin where they find pessimism. So I'm curious if it's a completely different topic for you where you're finding your hope, or if it's like a different perspective on the thing that you are worried about.
I don't know. I think for me, hope comes when I think about the local level, when I think about individuals, because in essence, this is where things have to start to overcome any potential disaster of any kind. And when I see, when I see my neighbors who I know to be good and decent people, when I see coverage of someone who is, helping someone perhaps they don't even know, my hope comes, I think, in the human spirit and hoping that we can band together enough individuals who have that human goodness to stand in the way to block the few who are trying to fight what I think is just coexistence, peaceful coexistence.
Well, it's interesting. My mind first went to every natural disaster. While it shows the power of nature, also shows the power of giving, love, concern. It's remarkable how people in communities will come together to help out their neighbors, and even how folks who aren't their neighbors will get into the drive to help and send some needed resources. But the other thing, I guess, I have my hope placed in the next generation, which I do hope, yes, it turns out to be the tolerant, the concerned, the people-oriented, community-oriented, perhaps. Of all of our racial groups, the group of biracials were the group that said family and community is the most important dream for their future. And I'm just hoping that they are able to fight the forces, which really do seem like evil forces in so many places, and triumph, be triumphant.
Oh, absolutely. I feel like there's so much to unpack there. We could talk for a whole other hour about the prompt that you just gave. And of course, we won't be able to, but I'm just so grateful for the work that you two do, for the time that you spent with us today, for enlightening us on this really important project. Everybody, the book is Dreams of a Lifetime: How Who We Are Shapes How We Imagine Our Future. Karen and Jan, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Really delightful to have a chance to talk to you.
Oh, I'm so glad. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.